Welcome to the show, and thank you all for being here. And before we begin, I'd like to say a special thank you to all of our supporters. We appreciate your generosity. If you're interested in supporting the show, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal, where you can make a one-time donation. And don't forget that sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to the podcast helps to support us as well, and we thank you. As 2020 comes to an end, I want to remind all of you how grateful I am to have you as listeners and supporters. This past year has been hard on everyone, but there is a silver lining. The listener stories that you've shared have helped people to come together and realize that we're not alone in the experiences that we've had. And tonight, I'm going to revisit some of these stories from the past year, and believe me when I say that there's quite a few, and for this reason, we'll be breaking them into 2 parts. Now, by no means is this a definitive list, or a list of my favorites, as every single story that I receive is special. It's simply a list of the experiences that have stuck with me throughout the year. So without further delay, get comfortable and enjoy this first part of our listener stories recap of 2020. Our first story comes to us from Holly, and Holly has a 2-part story. Holly says, "Hi Nick, I just got into your podcast on a really long drive, and I listened to pretty much all of your episodes. I've had a lot of familiar experiences to other listeners, but there's 2 instances that came to the forefront of my mind with an intensity that I had to pull over to catch my breath. Let me preface this 2-part story with the fact that I am open-minded and a believer in the paranormal. Having heritage on both the Celtic and Native American side, I feel very vulnerable around paranormal activity. I don't really talk to anyone about what I experience, so here goes. About 2 years ago, I was with my now ex-boyfriend. We were house/barn sitting for his parents as they were out of town for about 2 weeks. Now, we lived in western New York, in a super small farm town. The house his parents owned was a carriage house on a long coach line, and at one point was believed to be part of the Underground Railroad, as we were pretty close to the Canadian border. Most of the house was all original, with a few additions to accommodate the growing family. My ex was extremely sensitive to the paranormal, and had had many experiences, especially on his parents' property. When the first experience happened, we were sleeping in the newest addition on the house, which had one of those sliding track solid doors. We had been drinking, both of us just turned 21, but decided it was time to go to bed, so we could get up early to milk the cows. I remember being fast asleep and waking up for pretty much no reason. I remember opening my eyes and looking toward the door, only to watch it open slowly and hearing it scrape on the track. Now, I have pretty bad eyesight, so without my glasses I normally can only see blobby-like shapes. Thinking his family had come home early, I quickly put my glasses on and looked back at the door. I only saw a blacker-than-black shadow with a tall, wide-brimmed hat. I remember thinking something along the lines of, "That's odd," and then falling back asleep with my glasses still on. The next time I stayed at the house, about 3 days later, my ex and I had decided to sleep in a different, warmer room in the old house. He left his 120-pound Mastiff downstairs, tied up within the reach of plenty of food and water. The dog had his own room in the house, but it didn't have a door, and he could be destructive if left alone for too long. I remember crawling into bed, pulling the blankets up to my ears, and falling deeply and quickly to sleep. I remember waking up to a low rumbling sound, and since thunderstorms are pretty common where I'm from, I didn't think much of it. I rolled over and hung my arm off the edge of the bed, and nearly jumped out of my skin when the dog licked my hand. I distinctly remembered hooking his leash and closing our door. How did he get in? I leaned over the edge of the bed and looked at the dog, noticing his collar was still on, so he hadn't slipped it off. I didn't think much of it. The end of his leash was only tied with a safety knot, in case he needed to be untied quickly. I figured he'd done it himself. I rolled over and went back into a light doze. The next time I woke up was because there was a light shining in my face. I remember thinking that there was no way the sun is up. It's like 4 a.m. I rolled over and noticed our door was wide open, and something was standing in it. blocking out the hall light we had left on to get to the bathroom. I remember seeing red eyes, a top hat, or like a stovepipe hat, and a gentleman in coattails. He smiled at me, but not evilly. He sat down on the edge of the bed and tucked the blanket back around me. The dog put his head on the entity's leg, but didn't seem too worried. I just shut my eyes and fell back asleep, and didn't wake up again until after sunrise. Oh, and when we looked at the dog's leash the next morning, it hadn't been untied, cut, or broken in any way. It had been unclipped. All of my research has told me it's the Hat Man, but I was never stricken with the fear like everyone else says they have. I have so many more stories to share, from Bigfoot to Thunderbirds to ghosts and spirits. I love the show, and I can't wait to finish the rest of the episodes. Thanks for reading, and I'm sorry this was so long. Thanks. I reached out to Holly, and she shared one of her Bigfoot experiences with us. This is her second story. Holly says, "There's one Bigfoot encounter I've had that still sends chills down my spine. Still living in Western New York, I was probably 13 when this happened, so 12-ish years ago. I'm an avid hiker and nature lover, and one of my obsessions at that age was endurance riding, which is taking your horse on miles of riding through some tough terrain. The only rough terrain we had was a well-groomed path through the woods under some high-voltage power lines, but it was pretty and went through the woods and cornfields for miles. One Saturday afternoon, probably early September, I packed a backpack and readied my horse, preparing for roughly 6 hours of riding. I thought I was the coolest kid, so that day I chose to forego any tack other than the bridle. No saddle, no bareback pad, nothing. Looking back, I'm actually glad that I used to ride this way pretty often, or what was about to happen would have probably caused me serious injury. My horse was always super steady, never afraid, and always took care of the little girl who put all of her faith in him. We were just walking the path, me keeping an eye on his ears, and looking for potential dangers as well. Then he did something he had never, ever done before in the woods. He stopped dead in his tracks, head and eyes up, ears strained forward. I heard something lumbering around in the woods, and my first thought is, oh crap, a bear. It wasn't all too uncommon, but it wasn't an everyday occurrence either. So I'm trying to get my horse to go forwards, backwards, to the side, anything, but he's planted his feet. It would have taken a gunshot to get him to listen. I'm yelling, singing, trying to make as much noise as possible to scare the bear back into the trees. Then, I see what's making the noise. It wasn't a bear. It looked like a gorilla, but walked like a human. Bipedal. It looked right at my horse and I. Now I'm pretty tall, and my horse was a full-grown horse. Sitting on his back, the top of my head would have been about 9 feet. This creature was eye level with me. He looked like a football linebacker with a toddler on his shoulders. Huge, blackish brown and hairy. My horse must have caught whatever smell this thing had, because he snorted hard and took off like a rocket. I barely had time to grab his mane before I fell off the side of him. Whatever this creature was, it scared him to the point of a belly-to-the-ground run the entire 3 miles back to the barn. The creature didn't vocalize, and this was before camera phones were big, but I so wish that I had gotten a picture, but it scared my horse to the point that he wouldn't go back into the trailhead for many months. Another experience was about 3 a.m. in the Allegheny Mountains near the New York-Pennsylvania border. I ran into a smaller creature, possibly female, because she made a very light purring, for lack of a better word. It was more of a rumble when I noticed she was there, and she kind of squeaked in terror, like she didn't mean to scare me. I definitely recommend visiting Allegheny if you ever get a chance. The local lore is fascinating, and the Indian reservation it's on is very, very rich in history. There are 2 museums in the park itself, plus a Native American history museum in the town. Thanks again. Let me know if you would like any more stories. I think I've got one for pretty much everything except the black-eyed children. Holly. Our next story comes from Richard in Ontario. Richard called his story Enlightenment. Richard says, "This story may not fit with your usual stories read on your podcast, but I believe something mysterious happened. November 2nd, 1979 is a date that changed my life forever. Growing up the youngest of 5, with 3 brothers and 1 sister. 2 of my brothers are 12, 10 years, and my sister is 8 years older. My other brother Jeff was the closest to my age, with just over 3 years. Well, exactly 3 years and 24 days. Being so close in age, Jeff was the only sibling I played and interacted with daily. We had a group of friends all within the same age group on our street. We would do all the things boys do, along with a few we shouldn't. One thing we truly enjoyed was wrestling and play fighting. This was no different on the night of November 2nd. Jeff, along with 2 friends and myself, were wrestling on the front lawn of my parents' house. After about 20 minutes, my brother Jeff sat up and said he needed to rest. He then slumped over and did not move or speak. We thought he was fooling around, so we tickled him and tried to get him to laugh or wake up. After a few seconds, I realized there was something wrong. Jeff was born with a heart defect and had had surgery in early summer, a few years prior. By the end of that summer, he was back to his old self. However, my parents did tell everyone about the possibility that he would continue to have some issues. Once I realized that something was seriously wrong with him, I asked my 2 friends to stay with Jeff, and I would go get my brother and his friends, who were partying in the basement of my parents' house. One of my brother's friends was in university to become a doctor. Entering the front door, I had to pass by the living room where my parents were watching TV. As I crossed the doorway, my mother asked me what was wrong. I did not answer. I proceeded past the living room and down the stairs to the basement. Entering what my brother called the swamp, aka his very large bedroom, my brother Pete almost immediately looked up and said, "There's something wrong with Jeff." After that point, things started to become a dream. I don't know how we got from the basement back outside, but the next memory was seeing my brother's friend trying to resuscitate Jeff. I walked past them and re-entered the front door of the house. The living room was empty. Passing the kitchen, I saw another of Pete's friends yelling on the phone to hurry up. I continued down the hall and past our spare bedroom. There I saw one of my friends staring at our fish tank with a glazed look on his face. My next memory was watching the ambulance start down the street. A few of Pete's friends stayed with me while my parents were at the hospital. At around 11:45 p.m., Pete and my parents returned home. I was cleaning up my room when my mother opened my door with a look on her face I could understand. Jeff was gone. That night my mother held me while she tried to sleep. The next morning, all my friends from our street were in a fort that my brother Jeff had designed, built, and wired for electricity. The fort had a small bar and bench seating along 2 walls. I was sitting behind the bar. No one was saying anything. We were all in shock. At one point, I looked down and saw a light switch lying on the floor. Picking it up, I experienced something I had never felt before or since. A tingle started at the bottom of my spine and worked its way up to my head. Looking at the switch in my hand, I knew exactly how Jeff did the electrical work in the fort. I had never known anything about electrical. I had no clue how a switch worked, how lights turned on or off, but from that moment, I knew how he did the electrical and designed the fort. I looked at my friends and said, "I know how he did it. I know how he did everything." A few days later, my mother approached me and gave me Jeff's bank book. Jeff and I had been saving our paper route money to buy a snowblower to start our own snow removal business that winter. I asked her why I was getting his money. She said, "The knowledge and money of a person who dies goes to the person they love the most." I had never told my mother about the light switch incident. This totally freaked me out. I truly believe that this knowledge was passed to me that day. I understand everything about electricity, electronics, design, and how things are built. Over the past 40 years, I have rewired, renovated, and maintained my homes. Last year, I started to build a 1,000 square foot addition to my current home. Thanks for reading. Rich. Our next story comes from Italia. Italia says, "I love your show and I love hearing the stories. I accidentally found your podcast and have recently started listening on a daily basis. Whether you decide to include this in your podcast is entirely up to you. I just want to know that what I am experiencing, other people have felt this too, and that I'm not alone. Let me start by saying that the earliest nightmares I can remember was when I was 7 or 8 years old. I don't remember what they consisted of, but I would wake up terrified, covered in sweat. This was a consistent occurrence, so much so that I would sleep with my mom in her bed for months at a time, until I deemed it safe to go back to my room, in which I would spend one night, have another nightmare, and repeat the whole cycle again. But even sleeping with my mom, I would still have the same nightmare. Eventually, as I grew older, the nightmares stopped completely, until I reached adulthood. In adulthood, my nightmares graduated to night terrors and sleep paralysis. Usually, my night terrors or episodes of sleep paralysis will last for about a week straight, meaning that I will have a nightmare, night terror, or an episode of sleep paralysis every single night for a week straight, maybe 10 days at the most, and then they disappear for months at a time, or in some cases, a year or two. The most recurring night terror that I have had is still so vivid in my mind. It's very present in my imagination, because it's as if it was really happening to me, and I had that nightmare or night terror for over 2 years, again with breaks in between, but it was always the same for the most part, but we'll get back to that later. At the time, I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with my husband and daughter. The dream starts with me sitting in my living room, and it's daylight, and all of a sudden everything goes dark, and I'm running in fear for my life. This is going to sound weird, but at the start of the dream, it's as if I know what's happening, and I think to myself, oh no, not again. I know the drill, and I know what's going to happen. I dart to my daughter's room to make sure that she's okay, which she always is, and then I start running to my room. I am running through a long hallway, which my apartment did not have. I am running and I look back, and there's something chasing me. I can't see what it is, but all I know is that I'm running for my life. I know that I need to run. I know that I need to wake myself up. I know that I am in a dream, and I know that I will find my body asleep in my bed, and that I need to wake myself up to end this nightmare. I finally reach my room and I can see myself and my husband sleeping. I look back once again behind me, and I still can't see what it is. All I know is that I need to wake myself up, because otherwise it will get me. I jump on the bed on top of myself, and I'm trying to wake myself up. I cannot for the life of me wake me up, but I keep shaking myself, screaming at myself, at the top of my lungs to wake up. The dream me is shaking me awake, and actual me knows that I need to wake up, and I am paralyzed. I can only move my hand, and I search for my husband's hand because he knows the drill. Once actual me can reach his hand, I am able to vocalize only whimpers, because dream me is still screaming in my face and terrifying me because I know that whatever it is, it's getting closer. When my husband actually realizes what's happening, he wakes me up, and it's as if I can finally breathe again, like I was holding in my breath and didn't realize it. For the most part, I said the dream is always the same. The components are always the same, with the exception that my apartment will be in the same state in my dream as it was how I left it the night before. The creepy part is that I have had this nightmare and I saw my daughter asleep in her bed, safe sleeping in a certain position in my dream, and when I wake up and go check on her, she's in that same position, and I catch a glimpse of it before she moves positions, as if whatever was chasing me wanted me to see their influence in my life outside my dream. Please bear with me, I know this is long. The reason I'm writing is because we, in the last year, moved apartments, and my dreams have been gone for about a year, until recently. Recently, I feel as if I'm being watched while I sleep. My husband and I sleep with our door open, and we always have, and so does our daughter. She used to have night terrors, and we would always leave the hall light on, and it was just easier to hear her if she was having a night terror, and we became used to it. For the last 3 weeks, I will go to sleep, and I am closest to the door, and my bed faces my door, and I can feel someone peeking from the other side of the wall into my room. I feel like I'm being watched, and then as soon as I wake up, I look at the hall into the area, and nothing is there, and something next to my bed is telling me that it's okay to go to sleep. I go back to sleep only to be woken up again, to repeat the cycle again. This usually happens about 3 to 4 times a night, and it doesn't stop there. I was at work telling my coworker what was going on, because I was really sleep deprived, and we were talking about it when all of a sudden we heard voices talking near us, and we turned to look, and no one was there. No one but us. The other night, my husband and I were on our computers. Our computers are next to each other, and he's to my right. My right arm starts going really, really cold. He touches my left arm, and it's warm, and I told him I felt scared. Probably not a good idea, because he starts yelling really, really loudly. He says, "Whatever you are not welcome in our home. Get out and leave us alone." When he did that, my right arm feels like there's blood circulating through it again. I don't know what's going on, but I know that I want this to stop. I'm very sleep deprived and I need sleep. I don't know what to do and it feels lonely. Thank you for listening. Our next story comes from Chris in British Columbia. Chris says, I'm 26 years old and I live in British Columbia, Canada. I and my friend saw a 7 to 8 foot tall white being in his backyard forest in the rural part of my city at night. It was in the shape of an upside down V or U. It was swaying back and forth silently, and I felt like I was going to die. It was pure white, and when I say pure white, I mean paper or bone white, not see-through, just pure white, long limbs, from what we could see in the dark. It was so white that it looked like it was almost giving off light, but it wasn't, because it was not shining or illuminating the trees or ground around it, and I'm pretty sure you could see shadow on it, from it moving back and forth in the same place between the trees. It looked bulky and strong at the top and shoulder areas, and where a head would be, but there was no head that we could see. It looked solid and looked three-dimensional. I can only describe it as 7 to 8 feet tall, shiny separated curtains in the shape of an upside-down V or U, with some sort of bulkiness or shape to the top half. The whole thing was swaying, touching the forest floor right and left, back and forth, in a specific motion with no sound at all. Absolutely no wind, dead silent. The two long legs or arms almost looked if how the front view of an ape crawling on all fours would look like, as if they were hunched in front. I tried my best to squint my eyes and adjust them to the supernatural being, dark being better to see what it was doing, or if I could make out what it looked like better, but it did not help at all. It just still appeared as I described. I started to feel impending doom, the sinking feeling in your chest. It started to set in as I was watching it silently swaying back and forth, and I felt like I was going to die or something really bad was going to happen. We left the forest immediately and didn't venture further into the forest or attempt to go up to it. I felt like I was in extreme danger, and I know the feeling pretty well from past experiences to know when I am in danger. A variation of the one we saw, or the same one we saw, were caught on camera in Fresno, California, and labeled the Fresno Nightcrawlers. The different First Nations here in British Columbia call them by various different names. They use a double-headed serpent to represent them, and they are some kind of specific supernatural beings. I wrote out me and my friend's whole encounter here, including research based off of what I was told personally by someone who is First Nations, that lives an hour away from me and the location where we saw the being. Our next story comes from Niche in Colorado. They call their story, Possible UFO Sighting. Niche says, I wanted to share this story with you since I found the podcast. I, along with my family history, have always had things happen. Anyway, here's the story. I have so many stories that I would like to share, though this one is most recent, and it occurred in 2018, between fall and winter. I have a part-time business thing that I do, and we have meetings twice a month. This meeting, I live in Colorado, was at a hotel in Centennial by the Reservoir Park. After the meeting ended around 10 p.m., I got in my van to leave. Just to let you know, I believe in just about everything. When I'm alone, I listen to loud music to drown out scary thoughts when I'm driving. As I got on the road, it was a side road going through the park. I watch the night sky to see stars as often as I can when there's little light. That's when I noticed some lights in the sky, and my first thought was UFO. I laughed and started thinking that it was a plane. There is a small airport in Centennial, and Denver International Airport is just a few miles out of town, northeast of the direction where I saw the lights. As I drove closer, I noticed it wasn't moving toward the airport behind me or toward Denver International Airport. Though as I drove, I started noticing that it had about 4 or 5 lights on it. My sight is not the best, but the lights were bright white and shined, hovering probably 100 feet, about 15 miles from me. I couldn't see anything else but the object. I kept driving, keeping my eye on it while I took a curve. That's when I had a thought, because I was still convincing myself it was a plane or a helicopter, and this was like a voice that said, "You know what it is. Don't lie to yourself." That moment, I got a sudden rush of dread. My body was cold and tingly, and I laughed, trying to play off the thought, but I heard it again. I felt my breath get heavy, and my heart was in my throat. I grabbed for my phone and called my now husband, telling him in every detail what I was seeing. He is skeptical and doesn't think the paranormal is real. As I turned away from the lights, finally I looked back in the mirror, and the lights were gone. I came home and went to bed. I know a lot of things are real. I don't mess with 2 things, skinwalkers and UFOs. Those put so much fear in me that I feel like I'm paralyzed sometimes. I never looked into what those lights were, or if anyone else had seen them. I played it off as just planes, but something in me tells me that I know what it was. I hope this story helps someone. Perhaps someone else saw it too. I love your podcast, and if you want more, I have many. Our next story comes from Callie, and Callie calls their story Shadow. Callie says, "Greetings, Nick. I found your podcast on Spotify and quickly binged all of the episodes. I look forward to hearing many more in the future. Keep up the great work. I wanted to share a few experiences. I wouldn't call myself sensitive to the paranormal. There have been instances where I have had an odd sense of déjà vu. These have happened more and more over the past year. Something will happen, and I will realize that I dreamt about the situation months or even years before. It's a little disconcerting. On the other hand, I've had dreams where I've talked to loved ones shortly after they have passed. These visits are always nice, and they let me know that they're okay. The main reason I wanted to write was to share the scariest night I've been through. As a kid, I had trouble sleeping. I was scared of the dark and always had a sense of terror when I woke up in the middle of the night. I usually left the closet light on and the bedroom door open while I slept. I've never experienced sleep paralysis, just an overactive imagination. Most of the time, I slept on the couch to be close to my parents' bedroom. It seemed to be the only way that I could get a good night's sleep. I grew up in a Christian religious home. One night, I had a visceral dream involving the rapture. Near the end, 2 kids entered a room. They shut the door, and there was a bright flash of light and a loud bang, like a gunshot. A booming voice pulled me from my sleep. I don't remember what it said, but I could still hear it after I woke up. I laid on my right side, facing the back of the couch. My left ear was ringing. I touched it, and was surprised that it felt incredibly warm. I touched the back of the couch. It was as if a bullet had passed right over me. The couch was warm too, only in a small, round area. The fabric was untouched. I didn't think much of it at the time. It had been a crazy realistic dream. I rolled over on my right side, preparing to go back to sleep. I then froze. My eyes opened wide. Right next to the couch was a shadow-like figure. It was small, maybe 4 feet tall. The only light in the room came from the street light outside, but I could see it clearly. There were no distinct features, just a small black shadow, standing right in front of me. My heart raced. It felt evil. It stayed for several minutes, until I started to pray. Then, like a whiff of smoke, it dissipated. I stayed awake until the sun rose. Thankfully, I haven't experienced anything like it since. I convinced myself that it was a demon, but I honestly don't know. I haven't told anyone about it until now. It's been around 20 years, and my hands still tremor at the thought. I get scared thinking about shadow beings and the Hat Man, but hearing others' stories made me want to share my own. Thank you for providing an outlet. Sorry it's been long, but I can still remember that night vividly. I even drew what I saw for a school project. If I can find it, I'll send it to you and post it on the forums. Thanks again, Callie. Our next listener story comes from Shaylee. Shaylee calls their experience, Scary Story. Shaylee says, "This is a story about my stepdad and my stepbrother. Before my mom met my stepdad, he used to live in a farmhouse. My little brother was about 4 at the time, and one day, my dad catches him looking up a staircase and talking to what seems to be himself. At the top of the staircase, there's this huge window, so my dad looks up there and asks my brother who he is talking to. My brother then said to my dad to tell the owner of the farm that the place is looking good. So my dad says, "Okay, Cody," and shrugs it off. Later on, my dad goes to the owner of the farm and tells him the story, and the owner says to my dad, "Oh yeah, my wife used to sit at the top of the stairs and look out the window and watch over the farm until she passed away." I'll always remember that story my dad told me. I thought it would be fun for other people to listen to it. Thank you, Shaylee. Our next story comes from Anthony. Anthony calls his story, Old Hag. This happened in 1994, when I was 19 years old. I had broken my arm 2 days earlier, and was hopped up on the good painkillers. My room was in my parents' finished basement. It was late, and I was lying on my back with my broken arm on my chest. The lights were on, and I was looking up at the basement ceiling. I drifted off to sleep. Then I had a series of nightmares, all identical, all the same night. They started with me lying in the same place I fell asleep in, looking up at the ceiling, just like when I had fallen asleep. I began to notice a very unsettling feeling, like someone or something was watching me. I then felt like this thing was up in the corner of the room, floating up by the ceiling. It was like a dark shadow. I tried to look up at it, and it quickly moved to the opposite corner of the room, too fast for me to get a good look at it. I turned around and tried to see it again, and again it moved. At this point, I had a sickly feeling that this thing was not good. In fact, it felt very evil. I sat up in bed, now terrified, and the thing felt like it moved right behind my head. I tried to turn around, and the thing stayed right behind me. I could almost feel it on my neck. I decided to call out for my parents upstairs with a desperate scream. Just as the scream was about to leave my mouth, a cold, brown, bony hand covered my mouth, and nothing but a muffled murmur came out. I absolutely lost my mind, and my fight or flight instinct took over. I did both. I flailed and violently fought my way free as this thing started to grab me. I got a fleeting look at it. It was an old woman, wearing torn up and dirty brown rags, with old, leathery, wrinkly brown skin, and dirty, gray-brown hair. I would estimate it might stand 4 feet tall. Finally, I fought my way free and scrambled to the stairs. I started stumbling up the stairs and made it about halfway, when the same cold brown bony hands grabbed me from behind. At least a dozen of these hands grabbed me, stopping my upward progress, and then pulling me back down the stairs. I watched the door at the top of the stairs get further and further away as I got pulled down, not down to the basement level, but past it, down further into the ground. It pulled me down into what felt like the deepest, darkest pit on earth. It got me, and then I woke up, laying in the same position and looking up to the ceiling, just as in the beginning of the nightmare, scared out of my mind, wondering if I should scream out for my parents, only for this to happen all over again. In the morning, my mom woke me up and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but that I had nightmares. She said that my aunt, her sister, had called her to ask her to check on me. My aunt is a medium. She claims to see and communicate with the dead and other entities. My mom then proceeded to tell me the key parts of my nightmares that my aunt had shared with her. This freaked both of us out. She immediately called my aunt and started cussing her out, saying, "What are you doing to my son?" and asking what the hell was going on. My aunt explained that she knew what it was and what was happening. According to my aunt, it was a very old spirit that had been in my basement for years. She knew it had been there the whole time, but never told us because she didn't think it would cause any problems. It spent years watching me and ended up wanting to take me. At night, she said, it would even run its fingers through my hair. The thought of that makes me shudder to this day. My aunt said that because I was in so much pain from the broken arm, and since I was on painkillers, that I was in a weakened state. The thing, which I now call an old hag, had seen this weakened state, and its chance to take me with it into its twisted spirit realm to have its own way. I left that day and spent the next few nights with some buddies. In the meantime, my aunt had my mom sprinkling salt and lighting white candles, while she performed some kind of ritual or spell that would banish it from my room. After that, I did not feel the old hag's presence, although the thought of it still terrified me. As for what it is, I don't know for sure. If it lived at some point, I think it may have been an actual old hag, or witch, that lived alone, doing evil things in the woods. What I do know is that this wasn't a trick played by my own mind in the midst of sleep paralysis. After the military, I came back to stay with my parents for a few months. At this time, my aunt notified my mom that it was back. Luckily, I was no longer staying in the basement, but whenever I had to go down there, I could feel it, creeping up behind me, with ill intent. To this day, I still can't be down there alone. It looked very similar to the supposed ghost in the picture in this article. Thanks for reading my story. I hope you use it. Anthony. Our next story comes from Fox in Indiana, and their story is called Doppelganger. Fox says, "Hi Nick. I'm responding to your request for personal stories about doppelgangers, and though mine aren't earth-shaking, I've had a few. When I was in grade school, I had multiple experiences of seeing my double. They usually occurred when I was walking home. I had a rough childhood and went through a lot of bullying, so I'd often linger in the school hallways at the end of the day until the rest of the kids had gone. Then, when the coast was relatively clear, I'd head home. The walk home took me along a paved path that passed through a playground, over a small footbridge, and then through another playground before ending in the suburban subdivision where I lived. A few times while walking home, I'd suddenly become aware that the atmosphere had changed. I'm not sure how to describe it really. It was kind of the feeling you might get before a thunderstorm, like the atmosphere was charged and unsettled. My eyes would be drawn across the playground, and I'd see a figure either standing or walking in the opposite direction, and I'd suddenly realize that it was me. At this point, the fear would overwhelm me, and I'd run for home. The figure never tried to interact with me. In fact, it didn't even seem to notice my presence. After I moved on from grade school, I stopped seeing my doppelganger until I reached high school. This time I wasn't alone when my double showed up. Instead, I was sitting in the school cafeteria, having lunch with 3 or 4 of my friends. We were talking about normal high school stuff when a strange feeling came over me. I glanced up and saw myself walking past the table. I turned to my friends to get them to look, but when they did, the figure was gone. The event left me unsettled all day long, and I sort of felt like I'd become unstuck from reality. I even got lost in the halls of the high school, in spite of being a sophomore and very familiar with its floor plan. Though many other weird things have happened to me, that was my last doppelganger encounter. Like I said, they aren't earth-shaking, but they are mine. Love your show, and hope to submit some more of my substantial experiences later." Our next story comes from Janine. Janine calls her story, Irish Ghost Story. Janine says, "I just finished listening to an episode of your listener stories, and I thought I would share my ghost story. I have always been sensitive to paranormal things, and have had many paranormal experiences over my lifetime. The one I'm about to share is the one that made my skeptical husband into a believer. In 2008, we took our kids, then aged 15 and 8, on a trip to Ireland. We rented a car and drove to 2 different towns over the course of several days. In one town, we had booked a bed and breakfast for us to stay that night. When we arrived to check in with the owner, they told us that the main house where the check-in was full for the night, but they had recently acquired another house that was just 2 doors down and we could stay there. They took us there, and we got our suitcases into the upstairs room, and we were all going to sleep in. There was a queen-size bed for my husband and I, and there was a twin bed for the 15-year-old. They had set up a cot between these two beds for the 8-year-old to sleep in. The owners were excited to tell us that we had really lucked out because they had no other guests booked for this house for the night, and we would have it all to ourselves unless they got any late-night spur-of-the-moment check-ins. We all went to bed and everyone fell asleep, except me. I was reading a really good book and could not seem to put it down, but it got to be past midnight, so I decided to turn out the light and try to sleep. The room was dark, except for a bit of moonlight from the window. I was just drifting off when I heard something over by the bathroom door, which was across from the foot of our bed. I sat up and looked straight ahead to the bathroom door, and there was my daughter walking with her arms outstretched, like she was trying to feel her way around in the dark. So I called out to her to let her know that I would turn the lamp on. At that moment, I heard my daughter in the cot next to me say, "Who are you talking to?" I looked over, and my daughter was sitting up in the cot. When I looked back at the foot of our bed, the little girl with arms outstretched was still there, but vanished a second later. It took me by such surprise that I screamed and woke up my husband. I told him what had happened, but he did not believe me. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed with the lamp on. A couple hours later, I heard the front door of the building open, and I heard a group of people's voices as they came in and came up the stairs and went into the room next to ours. My husband woke up and mentioned how noisy the people were. They made several unquiet trips up and down the stairs, presumably bringing in their luggage, etc. We heard their loud footsteps on the stairs, muffled talking, and the door slamming several times. They finally quieted down, and my husband went back to sleep. The next morning we got up and walked 2 doors down to the original house we checked in at. This is where the breakfast would be. The owners were super nice and very happy to see us. They immediately asked us how it was to have had the house all to ourselves last night. We said it was great until the other guests had shown up. The owners told us that they had not had anyone check in during the night. I told them that we thought we had heard others there, but the owners assured me that no one else had stayed there. My husband's face went pale because we had clearly heard several people's voices and doors slamming during the night. Being sleep-deprived, and my husband being speechless at that point, we did not say any more about that or about the little girl I saw. In hindsight, I wish I would have. I have often wondered whether anyone else has had any experience in that house. Thank you for sharing my story, Janine. Our next story comes from Caroline. Caroline says, "Here is my personal experience. I have grown up with a family that believes in the paranormal, especially ghosts. Many experiences have been shared and discussed in my family's history, so I'm not one who's easily scared. My husband's grandfather died about 4 years ago. His grandmother moved onto his mom's property and put up their log cabin for sale. Shortly after, my family experienced a house fire. We decided that since the cabin was empty, since it was for sale, that we would stay there temporarily until we found a new home of our own, and then we decided to buy it. Now, the first few months, only small things happened. Like the front door was always coming open. It was so bad that we kept it constantly locked. We figured that weather had warped the door and that it just comes open. It wasn't until we mentioned it to Grandma, and her response was that that never had happened during the 10 years that she lived there. The next thing that happened during the same time period of the door incidents is I would constantly wake up at night to use the restroom, and the lights in the living room and dining room would always be on. I assumed my kids or husband left them on. After some time of this, I started verbalizing my annoyance to them, always leaving on all the lights, to which they all denied doing. At this point, I am coming to the conclusion that it could be Frank, the grandpa, doing this. Because of my family history, I had no qualms about speaking out loud to Frank. Frank was a very reclusive man. He was cranky and never came to family events, but overall he was kind. I started asking if he was here with us. A door started opening right in front of my husband and myself. I joked that it was his way of telling us to get out of his house. Now those were the small things. One night, me and my husband and our older daughter were in her room playing crazy marbles. My husband's phone rings. He picks it up, looks at it, and ignores the call. The curiosity gets the better of me, so I ask him who it was. "It was you," he said. I laughed, thinking he was joking. Soon I asked him again. You, he said more seriously, and then showed me his call log. I called into the living room to our 2 younger daughters that I did not want them playing on my phone. They yelled back, "We aren't." Thinking they are lying, I get up to go check on them and my phone. They are sitting and watching TV. My phone was in my room exactly where I left it. I checked my call logs. Nothing. So a few days later, my husband and I are lying down in bed at night. Both of our phones are plugged into the same outlet, charging, across the room from us. My phone rings. I get up to answer it, and it shows that it's my husband calling. I look over to his phone, and it's black. I instantly show my husband that he is calling me. Then I get a voicemail. It was just static, though. Unfortunately, about 1 year ago, I was erasing all the voicemails on a deleting spree and deleted it. I didn't even think about it until about 3 weeks ago, when I started listening to paranormal podcasts in general, and realized I had forgotten about the voicemail when deleting it all. Now, the final and kind of scariest experience. My husband and I were home alone. It was daytime, but I had dozed off in bed, and I was kind of half asleep, half awake, and I could hear this banging sound. It took me a few moments to fully wake and realize it was my husband banging violently on the back door. I run back to the door and unlock the deadbolt and open the door to let him in. This was a deadbolt lock and a handle on the inside, no doorknob. He comes in madder than hell at me and asking why I slammed the door on him and locked him out. He said at first, "I thought you were just trying to be cute, but then you just made me mad when you wouldn't let me in. I was banging on the door for like 2 minutes. I said, "Babe, that was not me. I was in the bedroom dozing off. No one else was home. The deadbolt was locked when I got to it." That was the last time anything at all has happened in our home. That all took place between November 2016 and April 2017. Our next story comes from Cassandra. Cassandra calls her story Denver. Cassandra says, "I have a few experiences, and given the blending of my Druidic and Native American blood, it shouldn't be a surprise. When I was little, I used to be able to see the future in small glimpses. I would dream on a Thursday night what the answers to my spelling test on Friday morning were going to be, for example. It was all well and good, the little peeks into the future I got here and there. It was never anything big, nothing that was in any way significantly beneficial. It came to a head in the weeks leading up to November 5th, 1990. Let me tell you about Denver. My best friend Denver worked at an all-night adult video store in Henderson, Nevada. He was a total nerd, the kind you can't help but love. Always loyal, always wore a suit, tie, and fedora. There whenever you needed him, that sort of thing. He'd helped me through a really rough patch in my teens, pulling me out of a place of darkness that no one should ever fall, or in my case, be pulled into. I loved him with all that I was, and my feelings were returned. He used to believe that his family was cursed, though, and after all that happened, I can't help but believe him. I woke to what I thought at the time was just a horrible nightmare, the kind that leaves you shaking and your sheets soaked with sweat. Taking time to catch my breath, I realized that what I had seen wasn't just some horrible dream. It was a premonition. Now, my friend knew that I am a full empath, with minor precognitive ability, and so he trusted me when I called him the following day to give him the warning I had seen. Hearing him promise not to work on the night in question, I believed him and went about my day as usual. November 4th was a rough day, and I went to bed early. Working with horses and birds of prey is more exhausting than one could imagine, but that was my day to day. Again, the dream haunted me, waking me early in a pool of sweat. Going to the bathroom, I splashed some cold water on my face and chided myself for thinking he'd ignore what I'd told him. Making my way to the kitchen, I heard the phone ring. My stomach sank, and I knew it was his sister on the other line. "Cass, I'm so sorry," she began. "Please tell me he's okay," I answered. She went on to tell me that my best friend Denver had been murdered while at work. When she began telling me what had happened, I interrupted her and finished what she was about to say. He'd been forced into the store's back area, where they kept the extra snacks and tapes. VHS took up a lot of room, and they needed shelves for all the videos, rewinders, and machines that they rented out. The man and woman had come in with the intention of robbing him, just as I'd seen in my nightmare. He wasn't planning on working that day, as he knew I often had prophetic dreams. He'd been called in by his boss, who told him that if he didn't come to work, he wouldn't have a job. Nevada is expensive, and so he reluctantly went in. He'd been conned into working a double, against his better judgment, and my warning, which was when it happened. He'd been murdered November 5th at 5:15 in the morning, for a measly $533.36. They found the couple in Washington state, after they'd stolen a car and kidnapped the woman's daughter from her parents' place. I was devastated. Having such a gift brought me such pain that I never wanted to see what was going to happen again. That's not how things like that work, though. You can't just turn them on or off. A few weeks after the funeral, I was visiting his grave, just to try and feel some semblance of peace. I'd been taking pictures with my 35mm Canon camera, as the old cemetery was beautiful at sunset. I snapped shots here and there, getting the old monuments and massive tombstones against the dying light. Taking a few more from where my friend was buried, I went home and began developing the film. When I pulled a photo that I hadn't thought would turn out from the solution, my jaw hit the floor. My friend was casually walking past my camera in full, identifiable apparition. I took the negative and redeveloped it, just to prove to myself that I was just seeing things. He was in that one as well. I called his sister and told her what had happened, and she came right over. Looking at the picture together, we both couldn't help but bawl. There was our guy, smiling rakishly at us as he strolled by the lens. I gave her the second copy and I kept the first. She showed everyone and was told it was a trick of the lens. Time-lapse photography leaves a signature on the negative, something to define it as such. My negative showed only the gravestones with my friend's ghostly form walking by them. It was truly a once-in-a-lifetime shot, one that most paranormal investigators only dream of getting. I got it by sheer dumb luck. It was like my friend was still trying to tell me that he was still there, still trying to comfort me. My copy and negatives of the ghostly picture were destroyed in a fire, and I'm not sure what happened to Julie's copy. Almost 30 years have passed since his murder, and while I don't think of him as often as I should, I know he's still watching over me. He's been that soft voice in the night when I've felt hopeless, assuring me that better things are on their way. As to the curse he told me about, all of his siblings have passed away, each before they turned 25. His younger sister Julie died of a stroke at 23. His brother Robert died of a drug overdose at 21. And his baby sister Lori died of celiac disease when she was 24. His half-siblings also met a similar fate, passing away at 12 and 19. His dad and I are still friends, though it's been almost 20 years since I last saw him. It's hard for me to visit him, as he looks like his son, and it's hard for him to see me, as I was the last woman that his boy truly loved. It was because of Denver that I met my ex-husband and started a family. While he and I are no longer together, we speak often, and know that we met because of the influence that Denver had in our lives. We both knew what a wonderful human being Denver was, and cherished the brief time he was in our lives. Thanks again for listening, and thanks for hosting your podcast. It's been a real treat to listen to. Our next story of the day comes from Champ in Texas. Champ says, "Hello, Nick. I discovered your show, and I enjoy tuning in. I have often kept the situation to myself due to the fact of how badly this affected me mentally and physically. Your show has given me the courage to finally tell this story. When I was 17, the summer before my senior year of high school, my sister and my 2 young nephews moved into our home in Texas from Florida, making it a bit of a crowded adjustment. However, I did enjoy having other people live upstairs with me. As a child, I had been a skeptic, until I often had many paranormal experiences, not just at my home, but at my friends as well, as if this energy was drawn to me. I often just ignored it, as I had never experienced anything negative before, until that summer. My mom was into the whole binge of going to antique shops all the time, and I was often dragged along as well. We went to this antique shop in Waxahachie, Texas, where I noticed a particular booth selling old photos for $1, and the booth was also closing. I bought a photo of a sailor that caught my eye, and I was just so attracted to it and to this day I don't know why. I also bought a box from the booth to keep jewelry in. I remember getting home and setting it on my dresser and putting the photo of the sailor inside. I called him Eddie. He just looked like an Eddie to me. The experiences started that very night. I would usually watch TV with my sister and nephews until I got tired enough to go to sleep. I stumbled into my room and climbed into bed like usual. I drifted off to sleep, but I awoke to the sailor to the right of my bedside. I laid there, unable to talk or move. He rested a hand over my hands and nodded, as if telling me, "Go back to sleep," and I was immediately able to. The next day I told my sister of my experience. Lucky that she believed me. She also stated she thought Eddie was a positive entity. As I too thought he was positive, I began talking to him out loud when I would go into my room. To make it known I knew and accepted his presence, over the next few weeks, his presence became more prominent. One night, as I played a video game in the upstairs TV room, out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw him walk into my bedroom. Another night, he paced in front of my bed as I went to sleep. The reason I was certain that he did is because my parents' room was directly under mine. They often complained of hearing the walking in the late hours of the night above them, and they swore it was me, but it was not. On a particular July night, the peaceful presence I was used to turned into a sinister one. The night after watching movies in my sister's room, I came to bed expecting to maybe see Eddie and drift off to sleep, but he never came. I fell asleep and awoke to the sound of someone sitting on my bed. My bed frame was wooden and old and squeaked when you sat on it. When I sat up, nothing was there. I looked to the front of my bed frame, and there stood this creature. It had what looked like wet, jet-black hair that covered its face, and the face was white, with no distinct features. It stood at least 6 feet tall, with extra long limbs, but the body was pitch black. It stared at me, and I was overcome with fear, and I couldn't scream or hide underneath my covers. It moved swiftly, shaking the front of my bed, moving quickly from one side to the other. It went to the right side of my bed, and that's when I could see that it had no eyes, just empty black pits. It moved to the left side of my bed in a split second, and got so close to my face, I could feel its cold breath, and it made a loud sucking-like noise, and disappeared. I was able to move once it left, and I was terrified. I went and slept on my sister's bedroom floor. I told her what happened, and she was very concerned, but we both had no idea how to handle this, nor did we want to tell my mother. For weeks I didn't sleep in my own room, and I also had nightmares every time I did sleep. I had a nightmare so terrifying that I was dragged down my stairs by an invisible force and thrown off, and I woke up with bruises. My nephews began to complain of hearing knocking on the walls in their own room. I began to be terrified of even sleeping. My mother soon caught on and was upset that I wasn't sleeping in my room and forced me to sleep there, where the entity appeared again, just as I knew it would. But this time, Eddie did too. It seemed as though they were fighting right in front of my bed, but everything moved so quickly, I couldn't decide if it was real or just sleep deprivation. The next day I told my sister, who finally told my mother everything. My mother, who's a skeptic, said we had to put salt on my windowsill and recite the Lord's Prayer and reclaim my room. My mother, my sister, and I did just that, and my mother took Eddie's photo and the jewelry box, and I never saw them again. I was never told how my mother disposed of those items, but I just know that she did, and I never saw Eddie or the entity again, and that was 6 years ago. I never told anyone this until now. To this day, I don't know exactly what the entity was, and I never bothered to look it up, just because I didn't want to open up old wounds. Thank you for giving me the outlet to do so. Our next story comes from Eric. Eric's experience is called Shadow People and Apparitions. Eric says, back in August of 2018, I started a second job at a church that I attend. It was a weekend gig, cleaning the school and the church. It started off pretty easy. I would come in early on Saturday morning, in order to beat everyone there so I could clean without interference, and then come in Sunday afternoon. One Sunday afternoon, while cleaning the classrooms, I started hearing what sounded like a large crowd in the hallway. I looked out and saw no one. There were a couple of teachers getting stuff ready for the next day, but nothing that justified the noise. This went on and off for the rest of the shift. I got a little spooked, and I told my wife about it. She thought that perhaps I was spooking myself because I listened to too many paranormal podcasts. I took her advice and listened to something else. Over the next few weeks, this phenomenon continued. It didn't matter if it was 5 in the morning or 5 in the afternoon. This was not an old building. Nothing creepy about it. It was a fairly new and modern-looking church building. No cemetery or the like. One Saturday morning while cleaning the boys' bathroom, I was wiping down the 3 faucets, and when I got to the last one, suddenly the first faucet turned on. Needless to say, I never cleaned the boys' bathroom so fast. Later that shift, it was time to mop. I went in and filled the mop bucket. I grabbed the mop and was ready to go. Just as I was about to leave the room, the hose turned on. I was like, hell no. I spoke into the air and said, I ain't got time for this. Leave me alone. I crossed myself and finished the day. As time went on, I never had another water faucet incident, but the strange noises continued. As fate would have it, a couple months later, while cleaning the boys' bathroom, I got the feeling that I was being watched. It was Saturday morning around 6-ish. I turned around and saw a dark head peek around the corner. I jumped around, and then a dark gray figure with a staticky outline ran across the bathroom and disappeared into the far wall. It was about the size of a 7 to 9-year-old kid. I nearly pooped myself. I took a break, came back, and quickly finished cleaning. This wouldn't be the last shadow person I would see here. Sometime later, at least a couple of months later, I was ready to vacuum the hallway with a very large, oversized vacuum cleaner. I was ready to start when I looked at the end of the hall, and there was a very large figure. Much like the one before this one, it was dark gray with a staticky outline. I guess it was roughly about 6'5", and really fat. At this point, I wasn't scared. If anything, I was more angry. I proceeded to just do my work, with or without the specter there. Whatever it was, disappeared. I never saw another shadow parishioner again. After that, it was always noises and the feeling of being constantly watched. From time to time, I would feel intense anger or malice following me. Toward the end of my time there, on a late Friday night, I came in to clean because of a wedding the following morning. I was finishing up with mopping the sanctuary. I looked up, and through the glass windows of the door, I saw a golden-like lady walk from the navies toward the school hallway. I say a lady because she had long hair, feminine features, and a long flowing dress, much like a wedding dress. At first I thought it was a trick of the lighting from a car driving by from the Beltline, since it was around midnight. I followed her to a classroom. There was no way someone could open the doors because I had the keys. I went into the classroom and it was dark, and when I turned on the light, no one was there. Strange, but yet not for this church. After that, I started delivering pizza, not because of the paranormal, but better money for a second job. Our next story comes from Dean. Dean calls their experience, Creature to be Feared. Dean says, I have been wanting to share more of my stories, but with some, it's hard to know where to begin. As some of the stories you've been reading are steered more toward unknown creatures, I will share this one. I have shared before about how I spent 2 years in Venezuela, attending a private boarding school, located on the edge of the Orinoco River, when I was in high school. The dorms used to take trips on the river on weekends as a way to get the kids out and doing some physical activity. These trips often included strange and bizarre experiences, which now seem insane and often dangerous for them to have taken young children on while the children were under the school's care. These activities included things such as swimming in the muddy river that was also home to piranha, large anacondas, stingrays, and alligators. They also often took the boys in the dorm along on hunting trips with the local natives, and had been known to come back with pets, ocelots, anacondas, sloths, and other wild creatures. This may seem a bit extreme and absurd, but you have to understand that the school was concerned with bigger dangers to the students, such as Colombian guerrillas kidnapping white foreigners, such as existed in our dorms, excessive political unrest, including rioting, gas shortages, and severe corruption. They did not worry as much about the physical dangers of a rainforest jungle. All that to say that a dorm trip up the river to an area near the natives' favorite hunting grounds was not something out of the ordinary. As our guide, we had an ancient elder from the local village. He guided us far up the winding river. It took us a full day, sunrise to sunset, to slowly move up a creek only 3 feet wide, just wide enough to squeeze our longboat, chiseled out of a large tree. Despite the jungle that seemed to encroach on the banks of the creek, it was deceivingly deep. As such, we could most often use our motor to push us through, except for the sections where the width of the creek was so narrow that we all had to get out in order to lighten the load, so our boat could be pushed through the sections of the creek as narrow as 1.5 feet. After sleeping in hammocks in the jungle under some makeshift grass roofs, we awoke the second day to go exploring. We hiked even further up the narrow creek's edge, with our guide promising us cold fresh water springs at the top of the mountain. By noon, we had stumbled upon a place where the level creek met the curving rocky waterfalls with a large pool of water at the base. Half our group continued on to find the source of the springs at the top of the waterfalls, and the rest of us, with our guide, promised to wait for them at the base. Some of the teen boys became impatient and decided to try out their spear hunting skills in the large muddy pool of water. Upon wading into the water, our elderly guide came running up, yelling and waving his arms. "Get out! Get out! Bob lives in there." He didn't actually call it Bob, but used a native name of which I cannot pronounce, so I will refer to it as Bob. We were all very confused, as we had never heard of this Bob. At the same time, we were baffled by this elderly native, who was seemingly afraid of not a single dangerous animal that lived in the jungle, and in his younger years was known to be a great warrior in their wars between tribes, but was now utterly terrified by this Bob. He was so scared he wouldn't even touch the edge of the pond in order to pull the young men out. He stood at the edge pleading and crying for them to save themselves and get out. In the end, foolish teen boys are not easily dissuaded from doing anything that is deemed dangerous or foolhardy. They were determined to go in, and so, for a half an hour, they hunted, and the elderly native kept his watch over them, a spear in one hand and a machete in the other, shaking with fear, not daring to touch even a toe into the water. After the boys gave up their fruitless pursuit of hunting, I asked the elder to tell me about Bob. He told me of a creature he had seen with his own eyes in his younger days, who lived in the jungle nearby and hunted the fish in that pond. No native dared to enter his sacred water, as the last 2 who did had died horrible deaths, being eaten alive by Bob. He paced out Bob's length, and it was about 6 to 8 yards long. He described it as being like an alligator with leathery skin, but standing taller than a man, and having sharp teeth. He told us that Bob was the reason they no longer hunted on this side of the hunting grounds, and why they never entered the pool, as when Bob was in it, he could not be seen beneath its murky water until it was too late. So was it an overgrown alligator? I doubt it, as this is the same native who would show the boys how to hunt and wrestle full-grown alligators with nothing more than a belt knife. I've always wondered what is living in that jungle that makes natives so afraid. My theory: I think it's the same creature I have heard of living on the top of a mesa in southern Venezuela. There was a Venezuelan documentary I saw, and would love to get my hands on if anyone knows where I can find a copy, of the scientists who went up to study the jungle at the top that is separated by cliffs from humans. They too met a creature who lived in the pools and hunted fish. They described it to be similar to a brontosaurus, but smaller. Dean. Our next story comes from Adrian. Adrian calls their story Ghost, Premonition, or Doppelganger. Adrian says, "Hi Nick, I hope this story finds you well. The experience I want to share with you I have only told a handful of people, and I haven't mentioned it for probably 2 decades. During high school in Ada, Michigan, is when I first started having notable paranormal experiences. I'm likely to share others with you in the future, but for today, just this one. It is the first one that I firmly and vividly remember. One night, I suddenly woke up to find myself immobile, but I didn't panic. I looked slightly to my left across the room to see a very tall man, almost as tall as the ceiling, standing by my shelves, holding one of my stuffed animals, a popple, if you remember those, cranking its tail around like a music box. I don't recall hearing any music, though. He looked up and saw me looking at him, and he told me in a friendly voice, "Don't worry, just go back to sleep." And I did, with no problem. Later, I awoke again to find him sitting right next to my bedside, leaning in, watching me sleep. He saw that I was startled and smiled a little bit and said once again, "It's all right, just go back to sleep." Again, I had no problem falling back to sleep. I could see him clearly, and I never forgot what he looked like. I was never visited by him again, strangely. But where it gets interesting is some years later, when I was going through orientation at the art school I was going to attend. I met a man who was the spitting image of this ghost that I had seen in my room years before. Once I saw this man, I was shocked silent. He was built the same way as the ghost. Very tall, shaggy hair, round face. Peaceful demeanor. I kept it to myself how startled I was to see this living person looking all too much like this spirit. That very same day, later in the orientation tour, he and I introduced ourselves formally, and we have been friends ever since. But I often wonder how it's possible that this spirit can look like this man, or vice versa. So strange, but I look back on it fondly, and it now reminds me of when I met my friend. I want to thank you for your podcasts. I enjoy listening to them very much, and I share them with others who I think would also listen in. Adrian. Our next story of the night comes from Gary. Gary calls their story, October 2018, Queen Mary Ghost Encounter. Gary says, "My parents were celebrating their 65th wedding anniversary in October of 2018. And they invited all of the immediate family to celebrate an overnighter on board the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. The Queen Mary is notoriously known as being haunted. The family consists of my siblings, our children, and their spouses. I think we had about 27 family members attending. My wife was well aware of the ghost stories surrounding the Queen Mary and was seriously considering not going for that reason. I convinced her that we couldn't let our family down, and that there were no ghosts, and that she had nothing to worry about. My wife and I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old daughter, and all four of us were in one room together. My parents had arranged for a ghostly tour the evening we arrived. We were the last ones to arrive, and the family was awaiting us at the meeting location where the haunted tour was. As we approached the family, I yelled out, 'Is everybody ready for a ghostly encounter?' Everybody said no, except me. I yelled out, 'Well, I am.' We proceeded to take the creepy tour without any incidents. After the tour, we had about an hour to relax before our dinner reservations. We went to dinner, socialized for a while, and then called it a night. About an hour after we went to sleep, I felt the sheets and blankets being torn from the bed. My wife was facing away from me and quietly said, 'What are you doing?' I said nothing as I pulled the sheets and blankets back over us. I looked around and saw nothing. My adrenaline was flowing as I laid back down, thinking, what the heck is going on? I started to laugh to myself, thinking, oh my god, this ghost thing is real. After a few moments, I felt someone sit down on the bed behind me. This freaked me out, and I completely froze, and I couldn't get myself to turn around. I was contemplating waking up my wife and daughters and getting the heck out of there, but I didn't want to scar them for life, knowing ghosts exist and can physically interact with you. So I laid awake for another hour before I fell asleep again. Next, I was awakened by the sound coming from the next room over of a man and woman making love. They became louder and louder until it woke up my wife and my daughters. My wife was so angry, she pounded on the wall to let them know that we heard them, and just like that, it got quiet. The next morning, we had to get up early for breakfast, so my wife decided to turn the TV up super loud to pay back the couple in the next room. When I went to the front desk to check out, I made a complaint about the thin walls and the people in the room next to us. The woman behind the counter told me that no one was staying in the room next to us. My jaw almost dropped as I explained what we had heard that night, but the clerk was adamant that no one had stayed in the room. That's all I got, and I want to thank you for the great work that you do. I really enjoy your podcasts. Our next story of the night comes from Tracy. Tracy calls their story An Encounter with a Native American Demon. Tracy says, "Hey Nick, I just found your podcast the other day and I'm hooked. Thanks for all your hard work. So to preface this story, it's relevant to know that myself and a few of my cousins, who are part of the story I'm about to tell, are practicing witches, warlocks, pagans. Some of us, including myself, have intuitive gifts. My cousin Morgan is very in tune with the paranormal. She sees and hears spirits often. I am an empath, so I pick up on different types of energy very easily. Now, here's my story. Ever since I can remember, my family and I have spent every Easter up in the Poconos, in Pennsylvania, very close to the notoriously haunted town of Jim Thorpe. The Poconos area is very well known for the rich Native American heritage and culture that used to thrive there. We rent a house in Towamensing Trails, which is a private community. We call it the Easter House, and it is a very important trip for my family. I am extremely close with all of my cousins, even though we are varied in age. I am the oldest of our pack, and the second oldest is my cousin Morgan, who's my best friend, basically my sister. We believe we are traveling souls. One year, at the Easter House, when we were around 15, we set out with our 3 younger cousins on our annual hike through the woods. We had a secret spot we always went to, which had a river and tiny creeks running through it, and many little pools and islands. We kept venturing through the woods. It was all familiar enough, as we had scoured those woods many times before. We came to a place we recognized about a half-mile in, a thicket of long-growing laurel trees by the river. They're more like bushes, super annoying to try and walk through. They were so thick you could barely see through them. Then, it suddenly became very dark in the forest, like everything had a shadow, even though it was the middle of the day, and we had not ventured into the thick trees. The air became heavy, and everything was silent. No wind, or birds, or animals. It seemed like even the sound of the river had stopped. I knew something was wrong, and then Morgan and I stopped in our tracks and looked at each other at the exact same time. Something was very off. We both felt different things. I felt like there was something animalistic in the trees ahead, something dark and evil, and it wanted to hurt us, possibly eat us. It seemed like a bear maybe, or a twisted form of a human. It's hard to explain how I knew this. It's just how my intuition works. Morgan felt the same. Something evil. She felt that if we went further, it would see us, and there would be no going home. I felt that it knew that we were close, but we had little time. Both of us, without speaking, knew that we needed to bolt fast. We turned in the direction the road was, and looked at our cousins and said, "Run." So we ran our group all the way out of the woods until the dark presence had faded, and we were back at the house. I'd never been scared in the woods like that before. We are all pretty outdoorsy, and don't scare easily. I didn't realize what had happened until I was much older. I am now 26, when I was listening to your podcast and decided to look back on some of my experiences, slowly realizing some of them were quite strange, and cannot be rationally explained. Morgan and I did some research on the legends of the Lenape and Delaware tribes that heavily populated the area. We found a legend of a Native American spirit called Mahuwe. Before I read you the description of the spirit, I will note that we wrote down all of what we could remember before we did our research, as to not influence our memories. Mahuwe is a Native American spirit, a giant humanoid man-eating monster that lurks in the forests and attacks anyone who comes close. It is very similar to a Wendigo, and is associated with hunger, cannibalism, and sin. We also found a spirit called Yakwahe, or Yakwawiak, which is a giant hairless bear-like creature that also eats humans. When I think about this encounter, Mahuwe just seems right to me. It's terrifying to think that we possibly ran into something like that in the woods right near our vacation house. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I do know it wasn't just paranoia. Something not right is out in those woods. That community has always been a little spooky, and the people there are strange. They have an odd feel to their energy, as if they're hiding something. Other strange things have happened to us in those woods, like getting lost in circles, even though we knew the area well, finding odd things in the forest where they don't belong, like burned-out foundations of buildings and random household items strewn about deep in the forest, and seeing people walking around in the woods, only to vanish in thin air. And it wasn't like someone had thrown these items out of their car or something. I'm talking miles into the forest. Also, some time glitch stuff has happened as well. I have more stories like this, but I'll leave it at Mahuwe for now. As we got older, experiences diminished, possibly because the area is getting more and more developed and the forest is being knocked down, but that community and that area still has the same ominous feeling. I know I'll never go back to that spot though. Thanks for listening. All the best, Tracy. Our next story of the evening comes from Trinity. Trinity's story is called An Encounter I Had at My Grandmother's House. Trinity says, My grandmother lives in the woods, around a small town in the countryside, a couple minutes' drive from my own house. We spent a lot of time at my grandma's house, my siblings and I. I'm normally out all day and go inside after the sun goes down. It's not because of cougars that might live up there, or the hordes of coyotes that take down large animals. It's because every couple of months, something strange happens. I am a pacer. I walk around a lot, so sometimes I pace in my grandma's driveway, not too far from the house. My grandpa always has his porch light on after a certain time of day, and that illuminates the driveway, but that's about it. The woods around their home are concealed in shadows. I have pretty good night vision, and I think that's the only way I was able to see what I saw. In the shadows was one of my friends, who lives an hour away from my house. There wasn't any way that she could get there, since she can't traverse long distances that easily. I just saw her lower half, but it was enough. My gut was telling me that it wasn't her, and when my legs worked again, I ran to the porch. She followed me so silently that I didn't notice her until I looked over my shoulder. She was looming in the shadows, at an angle where I could see her body but not her face. I didn't go outside the rest of the night. The same thing happened a couple of months later, when I was out back. It was broad daylight outside, when I saw my other friend running through the woods. She lives just across the street from my grandma's, so naturally I thought she was playing a joke on me. I texted her asking if she had gotten home early from church, since it was only 11 in the morning. She told me that she wouldn't be back until 2 p.m. I followed my gut and stayed away from the wooded area for the rest of the afternoon. I have other paranormal stories. This one is just the shortest one. Thank you so much for reading and listening, Trinity. Our next story of the night comes from Vanessa. Vanessa's story is called Possessed. Vanessa says, Hi Nick, I found your podcast months ago, and I appreciate your time and dedication sharing the stories from others regarding the unknown. I have been debating sharing this story because I am worried that it's going to sound very cliché, but this happened in my house my sophomore year in high school, which was sometime in 2004. I apologize if this is long. I grew up with my parents and my brother, who is 6 years older than me, in Arizona. We lived in a 2-story house, which my brother and I had rooms upstairs. One night as I was sleeping in my bed, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from downstairs. I woke up and paused as I sat up in bed, wondering what and where the scream was coming from. After a few minutes had passed, I realized that it was my mom, and it was coming from downstairs. I jolted up and ran into my brother's room and woke him up and asked him as he sat up, "What is that?" He then jumped out of bed and ran downstairs, and I followed, because at least I was not going alone. When we made it into the kitchen, I saw my mom on the recliner in the family room and my dad holding her down onto the chair. She was still screaming and her eyes were open, but they were all black. Her body was all stiff, and she just kept screaming, and almost like she was looking around, but was not aware of what was going on. I was so scared and had to leave the room. My grandma was there, and she was very religious, and holding the rosary and saying prayers as she walked back and forth. I remember hearing my dad repeating to my mom, "It's okay, stop screaming." As I ran upstairs, I tried to call my boyfriend at the time, who did not answer after repeated calls. This all felt so unreal. After a few minutes, I did not hear the screaming anymore, and I went halfway down the steps, where my brother and grandma were standing by the door. I don't remember what exactly my brother said, but it was something along the lines of "there is something in the house, and he is going to open the front door." Keep in mind, at this point, the screaming had stopped. My grandma yelled at him and told him that if he opened the door, he was going to let whatever affected my mom back in the house. My brother did it anyway. Nothing really happened once the door was open, and my mom at this point was up and walked into the room by the front door. She looked like a zombie and was very catatonic. She sat on the couch by the front door and just stared in silence. I was still terrified. A few days later, we talked to my mom and asked her if she was okay, and she was confused to why we were asking that, because she did not know what had happened. She shared that she felt like she had got thrown out of bed. She had no recollection of screaming or talking to us during this event, to try and get her out of it. I remember for a few weeks, I was afraid to be at home with my mom, because I had no idea what was going to happen, and I feared I was going to be able to fight whatever that was if it came back. To this day, my mom does not recall anything, but it was very real for my brother, my dad, my grandma, and I. Thanks for all you do and choosing to read my story. Our next listener story comes to us from Maddie, and Maddie's story is called Newfoundland Bigfoot. Maddie says, "Hey Nick, first of all, I live in Newfoundland, Canada, and being in such a province, it's completely soaked in paranormal history and stories and folklore, and there is no shortage of the paranormal from one part of the island to the other. From women in white to aliens and ghost ships. If you can imagine it, then it's probably been seen or spoken about here. About 8 years ago, myself and a friend and my ex-wife all headed to a friend's uncle's cabin for a couple of nights. From where we started to where we ended up, it was roughly 10 to 12 hours apart as we walked to where the cabin was. Once we got to the trail that headed to the cabin, we had a bit of a rough go with it due to there being a lot of snow still on the ground. We got about 10 minutes into the trail and noticed a couple of sets of tracks deep in the snow. One set I recognized right away as being the tracks of a bull moose, and the other set I've never seen before. The unknown tracks came out of the tree line, slightly next to the moose tracks. The tracks that we saw were a fair bit bigger than our feet by a long shot. At the time, I wore a size 12 shoe, and my foot fit inside the tracks without touching either side. As the night settled in the woods, it was super quiet and unsettling, and the three of us were all a little uneasy and didn't know why. Myself and my friend had packed a couple of high-powered flashlights, and we went out on the deck of the cabin. We ended up shining the light down the trail, a little down from the deck, and we both noticed something standing behind the trees, about 20 to 30 feet from the deck. The tree was a full-grown pine and was fairly large on its own, and the figure that stood behind the tree was huge. I mentioned it to my friend subtly, and we tried not to show it much attention, and we walked back into the cabin. For the rest of the night, we noticed the figure weaving back and forth behind the trees, sometimes getting closer and then moving back again. We made my ex-wife aware of the situation, and for the rest of the night, myself and my friend took turns staying awake to keep watch. The next day, my friend decided that he wanted to leave and head back to his stepmother's house, and he packed up and left. Myself and my ex-wife stayed and just carried on with our day as if nothing had happened the night before. As it got dark again, the woods were still full of noise and life, and roughly around 8 p.m., everything got quiet again. It got really eerie and unnerving, and just as I was putting a kettle of water on the wood stove, there was a large bang on the side of the cabin that managed to shake the oil lamp that sat on the table. I stepped outside the door, and there was another loud bang on the side of the cabin. I called my friend to see if he could reach his uncle to see if anyone had come down the trail, knowing that this house was the last house just before the trail started. When he called me back, he told me that no one had gone on the trail, and I was told to call the local police for that area. I did so, and I was on the phone with the dispatch, and he asked me to look outside to see if I could see anything or anyone. I looked out the window and managed to watch a large figure walk past the railing of the deck. I had a hard time explaining to the officer that the figure was standing well above the railings. The railing from top to the ground was roughly 8 feet, and the top of the figure's head was at least 1.5 feet up over the railing. After a long chat with the officer, he agreed to send another officer to my location. While waiting for a call from the arriving officer, we could hear rocks and sticks hitting the cabin's walls and roof. Once the officer called, we were instructed to walk out on the trail to his cruiser. The walk was normally a 45-minute walk from the cabin to the end of the trail in the daytime. Being that it was night, I had a feeling that it would take longer. It didn't take us longer than 20 minutes to get out of the trail, but the whole way out, I could hear something walking through the trees about 20 feet behind us to our left. Once we got to the bottom of the trail, I was able to look up to where the trees started, where there was snow still, and in the moonlight, I could see a huge figure standing at the mouth of the trees for a brief second, and then it turned and walked back into the trees. To this day, I still believe that I had a Bigfoot encounter, and I have not returned to the cabin. I will have pictures of the tracks attached to this image. The first one will be just an image of the track with my foot next to it, and the second one will be of the tracks next to the moose track and my foot. For anybody listening that wants to see the tracks, I'll make sure that I post them in our forum. Our next story of the night comes from Gary. Gary's story is called Fatal Collision. Gary says, in early 2017, I was awakened from a deep sleep by the loudest of sounds, just before 1 a.m. on a weekday morning. My initial thought was that something had collided with my residence, or that perhaps one of the doors on my home had been kicked in. After springing from my bed, I searched the home for any signs of damage or entrance. I found neither. I dressed quickly and exited the house, wondering if my home had been struck by a small plane or passenger car. I reside in a gated community in South Florida, and my home is a stone's throw away from the perimeter of the development. Adjacent to the community fence is a dimly lit 2-lane road notorious for serious collisions. I noticed the lights of emergency vehicles and realized that the sound that woke me was likely a vehicular collision. At the time, I wrote for a local newspaper, and my first inclination was to go inside and retrieve my camera. As insensitive as that sounds, I would have unrestricted view of an accident through the bars of the community fence. Again, reporting is what I do, and this was my initial instinct. I walked to the fence. Although it was the wee hours of the morning, the flashing lights from law enforcement vehicles and ambulances lit the scene. It was horrific. 2 smaller sedans had collided head-on, and the damage was devastating. I stood alone in the dark, moving my lens along the bars of the fence. A helicopter arrived to provide transport to an area hospital. "They're dead, you know," I heard from somewhere to the left of me. I was startled, as I had been alone in a darkened edge of the property. I looked up to see a younger black man standing against the fence. The mention of his race will become relevant later on in my story. "I'm sorry to hear that," I responded. Once again, I placed my camera lens through the bars and began photographing the scene. "This is a dangerous road," I immediately added, and removed my eye from the camera. I looked to my left, and I was alone. The area that I stood in was open and grassy. There were no residential structures built there at the time. The community has since been completed. I looked around, a full 180 degrees, expecting to see this unknown male leaving the area. There was no one in sight. Additionally, standing on a vacant half-acre of land, there was insufficient time for anyone to have left without being seen. I was taken aback, but was more focused on the accident than on anything else. Still, I found myself looking back several times, trying to rationalize the speedy disappearance. I returned home and emailed the photos to one of our writers and returned to bed. The following morning, I woke to an email indicating that 3 black males suffered fatal injuries, 2 in one vehicle, 1 in another. Love the podcast. Keep up the great work. Gary. Our next story of the night comes from Ashley. I've had strange dreams my whole life. My grandmother says my mother and I have the gift of seeing. But in correlation to that night, no. I just remember it like it was yesterday. However, since you asked, I just remembered this one incident that happened about a year ago. My wife and I don't really talk about it, because we don't know what to make of it. Then several months ago, I heard stories on here about missing time, and I realized that's what the situation was. Here's what happened. One night my wife and I were driving down Interstate 20, east from Dallas, when I saw a calm but piercing white light. It was too large and bright to be a star, so I asked my wife what she thought it was. She said she didn't know, and we continued to drive. As I continued, I kept looking up through the sunroof at it. It was strange and never seemed to move but remained in sight, never going behind clouds or anything. When I first noticed it, we were just outside of a small town named Forney. We drove for about 5 minutes, and I told my wife to look up at it again to see if I was tripping. She then focuses even harder to see what it could be, but still nothing. At this time, I realize that we're passing by a sign that says Toll 49, and I know that there's no way we could have made it that far in just a few minutes. I asked my wife if she knew where we were, and she stated, "Well, we just passed that under that bridge in Forney, so probably about Terrell." I pointed to the upcoming entrance ramp to Toll 49, and she looked as confused as I, and asked where we were. I told her about an hour from where we thought. We both started rambling off landmarks we normally pass, and asking if the other remembered passing them. Neither of us could. Weirded out and scared about how we could drive an hour and not remember anything, we just stopped talking about it, cranked up the music, and hightailed it the rest of the way to our destination. Our next story of the night comes from Lauren. Lauren calls her story, Haunted by a Friend. Lauren says, "Hey Nick, I wanted to email you because I haven't heard too many positive encounters with spirits, and I think everyone will enjoy this. Keep up the great work." Anyway, on to my story. My family and I invited a stranger to live with us back in November. I know, sounds crazy, but my best friend and her children also lived in our house too. This was her boyfriend. We'll call him Sam for privacy. Sam was an amazing guy, extremely sarcastic and always cracking a joke. He went from a stranger to a full-blown family member in a few short weeks. It was so odd for my husband and me because we are very wary of people. We were so drawn to him. Our children were drawn to him. He was our best friend. Sam had suicidal thoughts. My husband and I convinced him to get help because both of us have been there. But due to Christmas and the New Year, all psychiatric offices were closed. He promised us he would hang in there and that he was fine. 3 days later, Sam left for work because his Christmas break was over. We got the call later that day that he had committed suicide and wasn't coming home. Sam knew that I was a believer in all things paranormal. We actually had a discussion one night in my garage about it. He laughed and joked about how he'd definitely haunt me if anything ever happened to him. I told him that he better. Fast forward to a month after his death. I'm vacuuming my living room, and I see something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned off the vacuum. I knew everyone was outside enjoying the weather, so I knew that I was alone. I shrugged it off because that type of thing happens to me often. I turned the corner to walk into my kitchen, and there he was. Sam was a transparent mist, but I could see he had a gray short-sleeve shirt and khaki pants on. He also had a ball cap on. I could not see his feet. He was floating, but was still his normal height. Sam did not look at me. He reached for the doorknob to our garage door, like he was heading out for a smoke, like it was just any old day. I was speechless. I was overcome with a warmth I can't even describe. It was a very loving feeling, but like a big hug. Before I could get any words out, he was gone. Once I got my thoughts together, I started screaming in joy and crying. I ran outside and told everyone. They believed me. All I could do was cry and shout, "He said he'd haunt me. I saw him, guys. I finally saw him." Side note, the outfit he was wearing was the same exact outfit that he was wearing in a picture with a poem on it that was given out at his celebration of life. I will let you know if Sam makes more contact. Thanks for reading. Have a wonderful day. Our next story of the night comes from Luke. Luke calls their story, Pigman or Dogman. Luke says, I love the show and I have a story. However, this story contributes to some of your earlier shows, especially about the Michigan Dogman. Then, before continuing with his story, Luke then includes the backstory and legend of the Pigman, and it goes like this. There was once an elderly couple who lived happily in central Indiana. They were originally married in their early 20s, but for one reason or another, they were never able to have a child. After close to 40 years of marriage, the woman became pregnant for the first time. 9 months later, she gave birth to a boy. Needless to say, there were complications in the pregnancy. Most notably, the boy was born with a nasal deformity, which made his nose look piggish. The first few years of the boy's life passed in relative happiness. He had trouble in school with the other kids, but he was loved at home. The family was happy. Around the boy's 12th birthday, his mother became ill and passed away. She was in her early 70s, so she was more vulnerable to sickness than most. The boy was now left with just his father, who was also in his early 70s. After the passing of his wife of nearly 50 years, the boy's father became heartsick and stopped eating. Within a month, the father had passed away too. The boy was now alone. With his father's corpse still in the house, the boy became aware of the decision he was faced with. He could either wait for the authorities to come and take him to a foster home or orphanage, or run away. The boy chose to run away. He chose to live in the wild. The boy chose to find water when he was thirsty, forage and kill when he was hungry, and start a fire when he needed warmth. The boy was known to break into barns and sleep on people's lands. He became known as the Pigman, and most children growing up in central Indiana knew about him. We teased each other about him. When hanging out with a friend out in the country, if you would see a spot in the hay where a sheep or dog had made a bed for itself, you would say to your friend, Pigman slept here last night. The Pigman is going to get you. It was just part of the legend and the lore of the Pigman. Now, this is Luke's story of his encounter. Luke says, I was 18. I had just graduated from high school, and it was the summer of 2003. It was August, and it was hot. Air conditioning never stops running, and you stick to the seat kind of hot. I was at my girlfriend's house late one night. She lived out in the country. Around 2 a.m., I decided to make my way back home. I said my goodbyes and got into my Ford F-150. The truck was old and prone to dying. It had 195,000 miles on its odometer, manual windows, manual locks, and a rusted-out hole in the passenger side floorboard. It was a ride fit for an 18-year-old. I drove through the country, heading home. The cornfields had not yet been harvested, so the stalks were at their peak. I came to a four-way stop in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by cornfields, when all of a sudden my truck died. This is not unusual, and so I reacted as any 18-year-old might react upon being stranded with a dead truck in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. The reaction involved banging on the dashboard and steering wheel, and using some choice words. I was committed to getting the truck restarted. I manipulated all 3 pedals and the stick again and again, confident that I would get the truck restarted. At some point, I had hit the brake pedal, which illuminated the road behind me, and accidentally at the same time, my peripheral vision had gotten a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror that struck me as alarming. I pushed the brake pedal again and looked in the rearview mirror to check my alarm. Sure enough, there was a dark, shadowy figure in the middle of the road. It was absolutely still. It was between 50 to 100 yards behind me. Distances are hard to gauge, given the situation, and it was on all fours. My initial thought was that there was a big dog in the road. I went back to trying to start my truck. Moments later, the truck starting situation had not improved. I decided to check on the big dog. I pushed the brake pedal and looked in the rearview mirror again. The big dog was closer. I didn't see it move. It was still motionless in the middle of the road, but it had cut the distance between me and it by about half. It was still dark and shadowy. It was still on all fours, and it still looked like a big dog, but big, like bigger than I had ever encountered. At this point, I became afraid. I had a newspaper's headline flash through my mind's eye. 18-year-old slaughtered in the countryside, blood everywhere. So I very calmly reached over and rolled up the passenger side window and locked the door, and then rolled up the driver's side window and locked the door. Very calmly, I set my attention back on starting the truck. Now, the next few moments become a blur. It might have been a few seconds, it might have been a minute. I don't know. But as I recall, my truck began to give signs that it was about to start. I noticed that the big dog was within 5 yards of the back of my truck. My truck then started. The big dog then stood up on 2 legs. It stood tall, like one of the biggest men I had ever seen in real life, well over 6 feet. I put my truck in drive, and this thing started moving towards the bed of my truck. My tires squealed, and this thing shot off to the left side and ran into a cornfield, as I was now rolling down the road. Needless to say, I was freaked. Nothing like this had ever happened to me. I had never felt dread or mortal danger before. There was no way I was going home to sleep. There was only one thing I could do. I had to go see my friend, George. He and I loved ghost stories and tales of cryptids. He would regularly investigate abandoned houses or any other creepy stuff that we knew about. I had to see him. George lived in the country as well. I rolled up close to his house around 2:30 a.m. I turned off the truck, popped it in neutral, and silently parked it at the end of the driveway. I walked up to George's garage and climbed up to the back of it. George lived separate from his parents' house in a room above the garage. I started banging on his window until he woke up. George opened the window and responded as any 18-year-old might respond when they were being woken up from a good sleep around 2:30 in the morning. He was cussing at me and insulting me when I said, "I saw the pigman." George got quiet, evaluated my face, and a moment later he said, "Meet me at the front door." So I climbed down and walked around to the base of the staircase from his room. A moment passed. Then the door opened. George appeared carrying 2 flashlights and 2 shotguns. He came down the staircase and said, "Let's go." We got in his red Jeep. It had oversized tires and big lights on the top. I navigated him to the spot where the strangeness had occurred. I had him pull off the road right where I saw the big dog shoot into the cornfield, and sure enough, corn stalks were bent. Something large had entered the cornfield at this spot, and very recently. The sight was reassuring for my sanity. A moment passed. I looked at George. George looked at me, and he said, "Let's go." We got out of the Jeep and analyzed the corn stalks. A trail of broken or bent corn stalks was easily visible. We entered the cornfield. We followed this trail for some time. I don't know the reality of the time. Maybe it was 5 minutes, maybe it was 15, but at some point, we came to a pause where it was eerily quiet. Then, all of a sudden, we heard something move. It's hard to see anything in there, but there was something southeast of us, which hadn't been moving. Then, all of a sudden, it was moving quickly and breaking corn stalks and moving away from us rapidly, moving to the west. I looked at George and he looked at me, and once again, he said, "Let's go." We kept moving. Another 5 minutes or so had passed. We came to another spot that drew eerily quiet. Then we heard something. It was somewhere between a dog's growl and an elephant's trumpet. It was alarming and terrifying. I froze in an instant. Then I heard something moving rapidly away from me. I looked at George. George was gone. George was running for the Jeep and had left me to die. After all, you don't have to outrun the thing. You just outrun your friend. I began running in the same direction. Nothing chased us. We got to the Jeep and we drove to his house to sleep it off. We came back the next morning to investigate further under the light of day. We were able to follow the thing's trail through the entire cornfield, across a road, and into a soybean field. The trail went cold at an irrigation ditch in the middle of the soybean field. That's my story. However, I wanted to share a further thought. This story is called the Pigman story, but only because of what we were exposed to growing up. Upon maturing and investigating the paranormal further, I now have a different interpretation of this story. I have now digested the legends of the Michigan Dogman, the Beast of Bray Road, the story of a siege of a farm in Mississippi by dogmen, and a story from a policeman somewhere around D.C. These locations surround Indiana. The thing stood on 2 legs, was over 6 feet tall, was dark and shadowy, and created a sense of dread in me. I now believe this was a dogman. I would love to hear your thoughts on this story, on dogmen, on pigmen, on whatever. Anyways, I hope you like it. Luke. Our next story of the night comes from Maciel. Maciel calls their story, Woman in Black. Maciel says, "Hi Nick. I recently started listening to your podcast, and I want to say thank you for providing us with a place where we can feel comfortable telling our stories. I also want to apologize ahead of time, as my story is quite long, but I had to share. I was 11 or 12 years old when I first started seeing a woman dressed all in black, with black long hair and a long face, staring at me in my room from the corner behind my door. She looked like she was floating. I would be so scared to the point where I couldn't move or scream because my throat would be so dry. I told my parents about what I was seeing, but they thought that I was having nightmares. At first, the woman in black would only stay for a couple of minutes, but then she started staying longer and longer. Finally, one night I couldn't help it anymore, and I fell asleep while she was staring at me. That's when she became aggressive. She started showing up in my dreams, calling me names, and telling me that she wanted me to die, so she could take me with her. She also started scratching and hitting me and pulling my hair. When I would wake up, I would have marks on my body, but no matter how many times I told my parents what was happening, they always said that it was me doing it to myself. A few weeks after this started happening, I got really sick and ended up sleeping in my parents' room because of the fevers I would get. This was the only time that the woman in black couldn't get to me, but I could feel her standing in the hallway, waiting for me. That year, we traveled to Mexico for Christmas, and due to my sister's medical condition, we traveled by car. I was still sick and would still get fevers at night, so no matter how much I tried to stay awake, the fever would knock me out, and I would see her again. This time she would tell me it was almost time for her to take me. During this trip, my parents finally realized something was wrong. When we got to my grandmother's house, they made me tell her what was happening to me. Surprisingly, my grandmother said she knew someone who could help, so the next morning we went to see this person. This person was like some sort of witch doctor. She gave me a long t-shirt and told me to take off all my clothes and only wear the shirt. She made me stand in the middle of a white circle and started bathing me with a home-cooked concoction while speaking another language. When she was done, she told me to take off the shirt and throw it in a garbage bag. When I got back to my parents, I noticed that my mom was really upset, but she wouldn't say why. I never saw the woman in black, neither in my dreams nor in my room again after that. I recently learned why my mother was upset that day. Apparently, the witch doctor told my parents that there was a woman at my father's job who wanted to have an affair with him, but he refused and rejected her. According to my dad, the last time that he saw this woman, she told him that he would regret rejecting her. This was all around the time that I started seeing the woman in black. When we returned from our trip to Mexico, my dad was told that this woman just never returned to work one day, and no one ever saw her or heard from her again. My mom showed me a picture of my dad and his ex-coworkers at a Christmas party, and I nearly fell to the floor. The woman in black who terrorized me for weeks was in the picture, standing next to my dad, with long black hair and a black dress on. To this day, at 35 years old, I have not been able to sleep with the lights off, and after my mom showed me that picture, I haven't been able to get much sleep at all. The picture confirmed it wasn't my imagination. She was real. I feel like she's trying to come back to get me, and I'm scared, even though my husband sleeps right next to me. Our next story of the night comes from Hannah. Hannah's story is called Belief. Hannah says, "Hi Nick. The college I attend is 4 hours away from home, so when I go home for breaks, I've found myself listening to your podcast because I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. I don't know if this technically counts, but I want to share it anyway. I've always been a big believer in stuff like ghosts and demons, but more skeptical about other things, such as guardian angels and some sort of afterlife that doesn't involve ghosts, which is why I don't know if this would technically count as paranormal. A few days ago, before I sent this email, my parents and I were moving my stuff back home from my apartment up at college. It had been raining the last few days where I live, which is highly unusual for the area. We were maybe 10 minutes away from home, me following behind my parents in my car. A large tree happened to fall just as my parents were passing under it. This is where the kind of paranormal experience comes in. The main part of the tree trunk came down on the back of my parents' car, with the front mostly catching the branches, including a 3-inch rotted branch that came through the windshield, but they were okay. My mom had a sprained wrist, and my dad had a pretty bad bruise on his hand, but other than some cuts from where the windshield shattered, they were okay, which is the paranormal experience. Everyone who either saw the incident, responded to it, or just saw pictures of what the vehicle looked like afterwards said that they really don't know how my parents are even alive, or at least not seriously injured, especially because the rotted branch that came through the windshield should technically have impaled my mom. We also don't know how I also wasn't hit by the tree or plowed into it, despite me slamming on the brakes the moment I realized it was falling, because I was pretty close behind them when it began falling. I'm not sure if guardian angels would count as paranormal experiences, but just the whole ordeal, there's no way there wasn't someone or something looking out for my parents and me that night. So I wanted to share this experience, on the off chance that there's someone else like me who believes in a lot of paranormal stuff, but is more skeptical about things such as miracles and guardians. Especially since I've had many nightmares where my parents die in some sort of car accident, and have always feared they'll come true, and well, they almost did. I'm still not really religious, but this experience did make me fully believe that ghosts aren't the only possible afterlife for us when we die, regardless of what scientists might say. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Sorry it's kind of long, and if it doesn't technically count as a paranormal experience and just some bizarre luck of the draw. I'm looking forward to catching up on your podcast when I feel like I can listen to it again without getting flashbacks to that night. I can try and send some pictures or post them in the forum later on, if you or anyone would be interested in seeing exactly how the car looked afterwards. I hope you and your family are doing well. Thanks for listening. Hannah. Our last story of the night comes from Shannon. Shannon calls their story, Shades of My Family. Shannon says, "Hello, Nick. I've been listening to your podcast since a little after this virus crept up. I've been delving into my interest in the paranormal after becoming bored with traditional YouTube videos. I currently live in Southwest Washington. The following took place in the middle of California, about an hour east of Sacramento. I had several encounters that seemed to fall under the same category of visitations and questionable figures appearing to me in the night. These all have transpired roughly between the ages of 6 and 9, but these two happened when I was closer to 6. I remember when I was little, ever since moving from the Bay Area, my mom would check on me before she went to sleep at night. The light was always on in the hallway, with my door open about a half a foot to let some comforting light in. My bed happened to face the doorway across my small room. This night, my mom looked a little different. I woke up for whatever reason and saw my mom standing in the doorway, except the light was off this time, so I could only see a shadowy silhouette by way of the window, letting in some neighborhood lamppost light. Immediately, I realized this wasn't my mom. She had glowing red eyes, and she slowly raised her arm to point at me, and she said, "You." From the moment I saw her, a slow, low, and steady buzzing had begun in my ears, like nothing I've ever heard. It slowly increased in intensity, until I panicked and threw the blanket over my head while I lay my head back down and squeezed my eyes shut in an attempt to wake up. Instead of waking up, I opened them eventually, and she was gone. The light was still off, however. It was unlike them to have the light off. I had this terrible gut feeling from this appearance, like someone somewhere is expecting something of me. Not long after, within the same month, when it was light out more, even in the night, Between the summer months, of course, I woke to a similar chilling experience. This time, however, it was my brother, or it looked like him. This time he was on my bed, on the corner where I kept my huge stuffed Easter bear I recently received for the holiday. It was my brother's shadow, sitting in the big bear's place. My brother and I are pretty close, so it didn't seem totally strange he was in there, except that it was the middle of the night, and where was my oversized stuffed black bear? "David?" I said. He didn't answer, and instead, the same buzzing took over. Except this time, the redness, like my mom's eyes, took over my whole vision. I could feel the redness all over my body, and I fell back, and thus fell asleep, as soon as my head hit the pillow. My brother said that morning that he hadn't gone into my bedroom that night, and instead shared or reminded me of his own experience he had had with the paranormal. I have a couple more similar experiences that involved something that may be the Top Hat Man, as well as a shared dream with my other brother, if you're interested. Stay safe and healthy. Thanks again, Shannon. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I can't help but look forward to hearing your stories over the coming year, and I want to thank all of you for the love, support, and trust that you've given to me and the show. It means more than you know. Part 2 of our 2020 recap will air this Sunday the 3rd, and as we gear up for a new season, we won't be airing an episode on Wednesday the 6th, but we will be back with all new episodes starting Sunday, January 10th, and I look forward to having you all there. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. Or visit us at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you back here on Sunday with Part 2 of our recap of 2020. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you for listening, and we hope that you and your family have a safe and exciting New Year's Eve.